thank you to our executive producer, Belinda Alcula, who always remembers these details. Thank you. So if you're not on mute during most of it, please do so that we don't have a lot of ambient noise in the background. You can change your view of the Zoom if you want to see people. Like right now, I have a PowerPoint open beside the Zoom screen, and I just go to the upper right corner and tell it to exit the full screen. You can also look at the gallery of people by clicking a full screen of gallery, or you can look at a strip of people in the gallery. You can also hit your chat button, which is located on the bottom. Make sure you kind of have that open all the time, because sometimes there's information communicated in there, and later in our exercises, we'll be using that chat box to share some of the out reporting from our small groups. And if you do lose a signal, or you feel like you're losing the content, sometimes you can just take your video off and you can still hear the audio. And you can also just leave the meeting and come back on using that same Zoom link that you were provided in Laura's email. And if things still are not going well, you can call Linda Cockett if you have technical issues. And her number is on the screen there at the bottom. And we will also be, putting that in the chat so that you can have access to some help beyond what we have right here. So again, just use good courtesy when it comes to your audio and your video, and we will get along famously. One other aspect of our night here is that we want to make sure we recognize you as the individuals that you are. So if you could go ahead and right click on your name, you can rename yourself. You select from a drop-down menu, the rename will be at the bottom of that drop-down, and you can type in your name, your pronouns, where you're from, your church, anything you would like to share with us, and then you hit enter, and that will show up in your Zoom frame. And mine, I just recently changed to Kathryn Witte, she, her, hers, or I believe it was close to that anyway. And again, you can just put in that so that we get to know who you are, where you are, and some of those things that help us get to know each other a little bit better as we go along. And now I'm going to turn it over to Belinda, who's going to do a quick review of our community of grace, our kind of our ground rules for operating, our compassionate listener information, and some self-care tips.
Thank you, Dean Witte. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad we can be together in this space. And I'd like to go over something, a lovely thing from before we had our name change, National United Methodist Women. This is called the Community of Grace. So we invite you to listen in love and with respect, hear each voice with compassion, be patient, respectful, and kind with one another. Respect each person's experience, skill, and talent. Every person has a gift to offer. Speak from your own perspective and experience. Questions are needed and expected and will be addressed as able. Speak into the space with gentleness. Respect confidentiality. Speaking out is courageous. Silence is appropriate at times. And here we have our covenant of grace, our ground rules for being together this evening. Listen actively with head and heart. Speak from your own experience. Be aware of body language. Respect confidentiality. Respect personal space. Own your intentions and your impact. Practice sustainability. Expect unfinished business, both discomfort and. We do have a compassionate listening service that's available after our Zoom gathering this evening, not during, but after, because we recognize that during our time together, you may hear something that stirs strong emotions within you, or you just may be having a rough day. And if you'd like to talk to someone about it, a compassionate listener is available to you. This is a person who will listen in a caring, non-judgmental manner. Please contact Kathy Speech Ferguson, the Conference United Women in Faith Spiritual Growth Mission Coordinator, by texting or calling and leaving a message for her. Her cell phone number is 406-925-1994, and her name and her phone number will be listed as we move through tonight's session. You'll see that in the chat. We suggest that you, if you want to write it down now or just look for the chat, it will be listed there. After our time together, she will then arrange for a compassionate listener to contact you. Self-care during this study is very important. Midway, we'll be taking a break, and at that time, you will be invited to participate in a 1-minute breathing exercise when we can collectively calm our spirits and our minds. And after that, for the remainder of the break, you'll be encouraged to step away from the computer screen for a comfort break, to stretch or get a drink of water. And now I turn it back to Dean Witte.
Well, this week we will be working to get outside of ourselves, to truly be in ministry with the world. If we recognize our current state of being and our relationship with God, then we begin to be able to look outward, maybe to the past for reconciliation or to the future to bear witness. But whether we know it or not, we're often looking back and looking forward at the same time. Our result is sometimes we're missing the present. I've read some of the work of some Middle Eastern writers, and this is a common thread among some philosophical thinkers, that we often worry about the past and we think about the future, anxious about the future. And while we're doing all that, we forget what's happening right in front of us, and we don't pay attention, or as Mr. Stevens would say, we're not giving it an attentive presence. So he encourages us to bear witness to what is happening in the present, to be brave, risk takers, to be there in the face of advocating for a more just society. And the Middle Eastern writer that I'm referring to, his name is Eckhart Tolle, Tolle, and the book is The Power of Now. And I found it to be an excellent point, that we tend to work on the fringes and forget what's right here in front of us, the here and now. And I found that an interesting connection to this study, because I think it's a powerful thing. So in our book, and we have on page 6, there is bearing witness in 4 moments. And Stephen sets out on this chart calling it in 4 moments, because it's kind of 4 things of a progression. And he starts with the module titles. 1 is existential and 3 temporal, meaning session 1, where we dealt with us affirming our existence. And we talked a lot about prevenient grace and how we arrived here already worthy and able to do what we're called to do, and that we have access to God's love, and we have access to God's love for all. The other 3 are temporal, or relating more to worldly affairs and attached often to time and place. The Holy Spirit is working through prevenient grace and working without us even knowing it sometimes. And this study is really trying to help us apply that to the temporal places we find ourselves every day. So God's grace and activity, or the action part of this chart, is really about justifying grace and our conviction of sin, while the Holy Spirit acts through prevenient grace before we even become aware of it. And the Spirit also enables us to respond. So God first bestows worth by loving us, and we respond through the repentance and the desire to love back in return, or reciprocity. The parallel happens in the church. When we are convicted of our need to love our neighbor, we then enter a renewed relationship with those around us. So when we practice attentive presence, we enter into a relationship. Deep connection really equals empathy. Empathy is a moral activity where we truly care for another person's perspective. It's that person's story, and we care for it as if it were our own. We can't separate the love of God and the love of neighbor. You know, love the Lord, love your neighbor. That's really what we're talking about here. So to bear witness, to speak out on behalf of a neighbor is for their full flourishing. We want to enable them to become all they can be. We cannot stop at mercy, but we have to do something about their suffering, to speak out against all forms of injustice. For us to love God and neighbor, we need to consider our neighbor's need for basic goods, basic needs. So when we come back to this chart, you'll find the first 4 modules are matching our 4 chapters in the book. We go from grounded being to attentive presence to historical clarity to meaningful participation. So the perspectival moment, which I find rather hard to say actually, is really the time frame in which these moments happen, or the progression. So first we start with our created existence. Tonight we're talking about attentive presence. Next week we'll talk about the past and sins of the past, historical kinds of things that really play into how we view the world and how we view ourselves. And then the last week we're going to look to the future, how we put all those things together for a preferred future that really is living out the call of God. So God's grace and activity is week 1, prevenient grace and our bestowed worth. This week, we're going to look at justifying grace and the conviction of sin that really is simply us looking at the present. And then next week, justifying grace and forgiveness. And finally, sanctifying grace and how we really turn that into action and being representative of peace and love in the world. So the moral activity last week was really recognize who and whose we are. This week it's empathy. Next week it'll be about how we look at historical sin, how we repent about that, how we try to make things right. And then finally, how do we imagine a different future looking forward? Relational content, dignity and worth was week 1. Tonight it's about love, loving one another, the great commandments. Next week, we'll talk about justice and really working towards a just world. And finally, the actions, the bearing witness and taking advocacy steps to bear witness in the world. So our moral emphasis last week was equality and human rights. This week, it's basic goods, basically meeting basic needs, meeting people where they are. Next week, it'll be right relationships and restitution for victims where it's possible. And then finally, how do we reach the full flourishing of creation? I think this table kind of helps, at least I've been referring to it a lot, to help keep the pattern in mind, because it really is a progression. Our attentive presence and how empathy enables us to love in the world. Love is our most basic need, and it should be available to all. Love is as basic as a person's basic needs to drink water, to breathe, and that's our focus for tonight. And I invite Char Elliott, who will read our centering quotes and lead us into our opening prayer. Take it away, Char.
Bearing witness is about my willingness to participate in what God is doing with my neighbor. To bear witness is to unburden our neighbors from the agony of an untold story. We are called to be present and attentive to hear one another's stories, and then to care for that story as if it were our own. Philippians 2:1-4. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let us be open to the hearing of the word. Amen.
Amen. This Philippians passage helps us move forward from the dignity and worth we recognized through last week's session, really looking at prevenient grace and how we were born already ready, fully equipped, to this week's session on our ability to empathize and listen and truly be present in the moment with other people. So let us continue our prayerful reflection as we listen to this centering song called No Outsiders.
So we wrote a song called No Outsiders, and it's basically that message that Jesus didn't come for a specific group, but he came for us all. That the gospel, the good news that we're talking about, doesn't have an exclusivity. It's not something that you have to be perfect to join, but it's something that we are all welcomed into. That there's no walls, there's no divides with God, but that with God, everyone is welcome, no matter what background, everyone is welcome. So we want to share that song with you right now. Chris is going to sing it, and I think you'll be really moved by it. Why don't you just allow this moment right now to open up your heart, wherever you are, wherever you listen to this, just open up your heart and allow God to speak to you, that anytime that you feel like you're on the outside, that you're not, that you're welcomed. Don't allow the lies of the devil to tell you that you're too far, but be like the prodigal and run home to your father. All right, Chris.
Knocking at your door, you took me in with no questions and no conditions. When I was a sinner running from your grace, you called me friend. You called me friend. And there are no outsiders to your love. There's grace enough. You are the open door when I have wandered, Lord. There are no outsiders. There are no outsiders to your love. There are no outsiders. Soul was shipwrecked, tossed upon the waves, you were the shore. You are the Father, and there are no orphans. Every tribe and nation gathered in your arms sings with one voice, sings with one voice. And there are no outsiders to your love. We are welcome, there's grace enough. You are the open door when I have wandered, Lord. There are no outsiders. There are no outsiders to your love. Tired, I was poor, I was thrown upon on your shores. I was homeless and afraid till I heard you call my name. And now I'm ransomed, I'm restored, resurrected, I am yours. I am found, yes I belong. In you I found my home. I found my home. There are no outsiders to your love. We are all welcome, there's grace enough. You are the open door when I have wandered, Lord. There are no outsiders, there are no outsiders to your love.
Kathryn, would you like to do the centering prayer?
Sure.
I'm happy to do that.
Go ahead, Char.
Creator God, you are the author of life. Yet you partner with us to author our own stories. You know both our joys and our pain, our happy endings and our tearful disasters. Thank you for sending Jesus to live the human experience, the ultimate form of empathy. As we share our hearts with one another today, teach us how to empathize. Open our ears so that we may listen well. Amen.
Thank you, Char, and amen.
Amen.
I am remiss in not being able to find more gender neutral hymns and music. I will simply recognize that shortcoming. But for God, there are no outsiders to his love, and for that we can be sure. Our special guest tonight has worked with pastors in several states and has many lay people also taking part in his work. And he has helped them to recognize just that there are no outsiders. So let me introduce our special guest, Bill Selby. He is an ordained United Methodist minister. In 1974, he was ordained. He has led both small and large churches in Indiana, Wyoming, and Colorado, including a new church development in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. Prior to ministry, he was in research and development, designing small arms for the military during Vietnam. And later, he taught in the mechanical engineering at the Eclair Technical Institute at the University of Wisconsin, Stout. And finally, he also was at Indiana State University. In 1995, from his experience, especially in the church, Bill created a new ministry resource for churches and leadership called Growth and Integrity Resources. They were created to empower the local church and its leadership. And one of the resources that he developed, the Center for Pastoral Effectiveness of the Rockies, became so important that it became a separate ministry all on its own. The center, based on family systems theory, now has centers in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. It helps to maintain ministers in ministry with more than 1,000 or more clergy alumni. And I would say there's probably several lay alumni as well, of which I am among some of them. He is sought out by leaders of the church, nonprofit organizations, and corporate companies for his work in empowering leadership to be less reactive to the natural reactivity of their organizations as they seek to become more self-differentiated, non-anxious, and better leaders. He grew up in a very small town in Illinois and married his childhood sweetheart from across the street, Cheryl Lee. They have celebrated their 55th anniversary and count their greatest gifts, their son Christopher, and 3 chosen daughters, Carla, Nancy, and Kim. They also have grandchildren they cherish. They make their home in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. And I have known Bill for probably a little more than a decade or so. and I have taken one center, and it was when I was in Nebraska, and I found the learnings to be very helpful in so many ways. And I think his work will have the same impact on you. So Bill, welcome to Mission U's Bearing Witness in the Kingdom. You are receiving a United Women of Faith enthusiastic welcome, even though you can't hear it. So welcome, Bill, and screen share whenever you are ready.
I will take a second here and get it done. Okay. Well, let me share with you that we're talking about empathy, which is just a phenomenal gift. I believe it's one of the most ethereal, spiritual things that we have. The capacity to empathize with another human being. No, to empathize with a puppy. Okay? That is so wonderful. At the same time, there are so many things that keep us from being empathetic. And when we want to, as a church or as an individual, even sitting in a pew, or perhaps working with your child or grandchild, or multi-generations, which raises anxiety. And in family systems, one of the things we work at is how to deal with that anxiety. And anxiety is a fear, and yet it's a part of the created order that God gave us. It's a part of our survival system. And whenever we're feeling anxious, we feel threatened. Anxiety is not the fear of something. Anxiety is the fear of the unknown. We're not sure where this is going. And conversations can be that way, can't they? You start with a conversation with someone, and all of a sudden, the conversation is going in a way that you're not sure what's going on, and you begin to feel anxious. Well, one of the ways that I think in terms of in terms of the brain emotionally is this way. Let's see if I can get this there. To look at our brain with, if you're a brain surgeon or a nurse or a doctor, this does not look like the cross section of a brain, but let's think of this in terms of an emotional part of our brain. We have the smallest part of our brain, the reptilian. It's the first part of the brain that's developed. You cry when your pants are full or your stomach's empty, and you get that survival. You survive by getting your pants cleaned or your stomach full. And that continues all of our life. The reptilian kind of process that happens. Road rage would be an example of extreme reptilian. But we can be with the person we love and all of a sudden be in the reptilian because we feel scared. And where does the feeling come in the brain? Well, it's the mammalian part of the brain that we refer to as the feeling part, the emotional center. Mad, sad, glad, and scared are all those major feelings that we have. That's our bonding center. And these two we share with all animal life. When we watch puppies being born and the mother dog is licking the puppies, it's a bonding process that we all feel, and it feels good to bond with one another. At the same time, the very people we bond with can scare us. We can feel anxious. And the cortex is the thinking center. It's about 80% of the brain or more. And this is not a scientific study here. This is the emotional part. But the cortex is the thinking, and it's the only part of the brain that Edwin Friedman, who is a rabbi, says this is the image of God. That we are uniquely human in that we have a cortex, which gives us the capacity. The cortex is the only part of the brain that's aware of the rest of the brain. But if we get really anxious and intense, we could suffer a reptilian regression. We can operate more out of the survival center than the thinking center. I spent a long time on this, and I'm going to give you that very quickly. But I'm going to show you how this might work with two snow people. Okay, this is communication with family systems. The two, if you want to draw this, the two snow people here. The top circle is the parent in us, that we all have a parent in us. You could watch this with a child that's 2 with a 1-year-old saying, no, 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 don't do that. And that's the parent, okay? We all have a parent in us. None of this is good or bad. This is just who we are. And in the parent, it's split up between a critical parent and a nurturing parent. Like for my example is if a child comes running off in the door screaming bloody murder and says, I just fell off my bike in the middle of the street. The critical parent says, what the hell were you doing in the street? While the nurturing parent says, ooh, that knee is bleeding. How about if we fix that and we can go get your bike? And then we could talk about it, okay? Kind of get the picture of these two parts of our people. And then the adult is the thinker, information in, information out. It helps us give us all this information, which we're getting a lot tonight from this study. And then the bottom is the child in us. We all have a child, and we have a free child or a scared child in us, okay? The free child, I say, kind of runs naked in the woods, okay? While the scared child is watching behind a tree, the kid running naked in the woods. Okay, you get kind of the picture. We all have this. Again, this is not good or bad. But when I begin to feel anxious, okay, this is where I feel I'm a scared child, okay? And when I'm a scared child, my survival system comes into play. And I want to be close to this other person, but perhaps the other person's crying and I'm not sure what's going on. Maybe they're crying really intensely and it's scaring me, what happens to the parents maybe the first time that a baby cries and the parent begins to feel scared. But of course, we know what happens if the parent cannot deal with that scourge. They can end up with shaken baby syndromes. Okay, that's where the scared part of us can go. Because when I begin to feel scared, I might jump up to my critical parent. Because what I want to do is I want to get in control of that which is scaring me in the other person. You get the picture? That all of a sudden, because I'm scared, I start being critical of the other. And you can see this in children when they begin to fight. You can see this in couples when we fight. You know, I kiddingly say, no, not kiddingly, but seriously, at weddings, I give couples permission to fight because there are couples who fight and there are liars. Okay, there's just not, it's just a way of life because we're trying to figure out how to survive as a person with a different person who, of course, when we get married, we try to make just like ourselves, and that never happens. And we begin to feel scared about that, and then we become critical of the other person. And when I become critical of Cheryl Lee, I lose my capacity to be empathetic. Now I'm working out of my survival. But of course, like all people in all relationships, when she begins to feel scared, then she moves up to the critical parent as well. And of course, where does the critical parent of the other person go? It speaks to the scared of the other. Now, those of you who have mathematical backgrounds might recognize a symbol there. Does anybody see that? Could you unmute and say what you might see in that picture? Anybody? It's a mathematical figure.
Infinity.
Infinity.
Yeah, infinity, which Isn't that the way it sometimes feels when we get into this anxious, cyclical kind of thing? That it's just going to continue going on. How do we get out of it? Well, what I say in terms of what self-differentiated non-anxious, and no one's really non-anxious. It's a person who's aware of feeling anxious. This part in the middle of me, in the middle of you, nurturing to free, I think is that part of us that God gave us in terms of being able to survive as a species, but also in relationship and empathy, having the capacity to be nurturing adult and a free child. A free child is one that I picture who is crying. There's a child crying in a nursery, and the free child next to them goes over and hugs them. That's a free kind of free child. But a free child in me also is aware of my feelings. My feelings are in my free child. My free child is aware of when I'm feeling scared, and maybe goes and seeks safety. It's not that I'm suggesting that you're ever going to be able to not have all of these. We have all of these because it's a part of our survival system. But I want you to hear how that anxiety can get in the way of my empathy. You know, one of the struggles of all marriages is how to hear our partners when they're hurting, especially if the hurting is because of us. And so we say, okay, I will listen. Okay. All right. And this is about me. This is not about Shirley. This is about me. And so I will listen. And she begins to talk. And then I'm thinking, how can I fix this? Because I'm feeling anxious and scared about her pain. And so I move up to the critical parent, not so much necessarily being critical, but maybe I will give her a suggestion on how to fix this. Is anybody getting the picture here? Okay. And we can do that with our children. We begin to feel anxious, like when they're telling a story about school, and we begin to feel anxious about that. And then we start saying, I want to make sure that they don't get hurt at school. And so we start to rescue them, and we tell them how they should do something. Well, the irony is that gets back right over to here. Critical does not necessarily mean anger. Critical can be seductive. Like one pastor said to me not long ago that a member came out of church saying to her, I think that the service would be so much better if we could say the Lord's Prayer slower. Now that sounds pretty innocuous, doesn't it? But she said she worried about that all week. How do I slow down the Lord's Prayer? She was feeling anxious about it. Well, the irony is the person who gave her that message was feeling anxious about something. And the message was, please fix my anxiety. Here's something to think about in terms of empathy. I cannot fix another person's anxiety. Has anybody ever been told to calm down? That works, doesn't it? Nope. And calm down is to calm our own anxiety. I remember the brother of a woman whose husband had died, and I was doing her husband's funeral, and she was in the back room with the family, and she was crying really loud. And her brother in a three-piece suit came over and said, "Can't you shut her up before we go out there?" Okay, he lost his capacity for empathy because his sister was crying and he had no idea what to do. But there was a message in his family somewhere that you shouldn't cry. especially out loud. I thought her wailing was the most appropriate thing she could do. And that's exactly what I said to him. Sounds like her feelings are exactly where they are. She's grieving the loss of her husband. That's painful. We can lose our capacity to empathize when we're trying to be in control of the other person's feelings. Okay. Why are we doing that? Why am I doing that? Because the other person's feelings are scaring me. I don't know how to get them under control. So sometimes we think, no, let's not do we, Bill. Sometimes I think I'm being nurturing, and I'm really not. I'm trying to get that which is out of control, under control, and my scared child being taken care of. Now, does anybody have an aha in this process? Anybody see themselves in that infinity issue? And how that keeps us, our scared child, which is so important. I don't want you to hear this in critical ways. My scared child is vital to me. But what I need to be more aware of is when I'm feeling scared and anxious, so that I am not making someone else responsible and I could be with them in their pain. I think one of the best gifts that we've been given by God is the capacity for grief. And real grief is empathy. But there's nothing more scary than having a child die, is there? And so anytime I've been with families that have lost a child, they come away from the funeral exhausted, partly because everyone who comes there, their worst fear is happening to someone else, and they're trying to figure out how to be there for them. Meanwhile, they're feeling scared inside. Empathy is lost in those moments. So take this with you for what it is. And if somebody has a question and wants to ask me, I know that Kathryn will let you know how to get a hold of me at some other time. It's an honor to work with you and be here tonight. So thank you, Kathryn, for the invitation.
If someone has a question, we could probably entertain one or two right now.
Okay.
If not, I have a scenario for you.
Okay.
My husband chose to stop eating and drinking because of a brain disease that he had. And in the process of that, people would come over to visit, and he would be, he was very aware of what was going on, but people would leave and he would say things like, I feel like I am going to my own funeral. And he spent most of his time like comforting them, supporting them, taking all his energy to make them feel better, when in fact, they never really would engage in a real conversation with him about what was going on with him. Yeah. And I could never figure out how to bridge that and how to prep people to have a more engaging conversation with him, because what you just described is what was going on. Mm-hmm. And yet, and I was aware of it, and my intervening, I knew in the moment, would not help. So what would you say to all that?
Well, that's a whole nother, let me just quickly say, that's a heck of a triangle to be in. Okay, you and your husband and people coming in the door, and in the triangle there's a persecutor, a rescuer, and victim. And the people who came in were wanting to rescue him, but at the same time, because they're their scared feelings about. How do you talk to someone who's dying of cancer? Well, I hope, if nothing I've learned from this is, we'll ask about the cancer. What does it feel like? What's going on in your life? But this is scary because you're going right towards what's scaring us all. It's the same way with when a child dies. How do you talk to a person who's lost someone? And so grief is that's the reason you have grief groups, because everybody in the group knows what it feels like. Okay. And when we're going through, and it's different going through it than being with someone who has gone through it. Empathy is the capacity to feel, say to the person, like your husband, when I'm sitting here, I feel scared to death. I don't want to hurt you and I don't want to offend you, but I want to be with you. And I'm sorry this is happening.
Upon coaching, I did this enough where I knew the people who I could coach and say, ask him, I know you feel bad, but he doesn't want to have to take care of you.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just ask him what it's like, what he's experiencing, because he'll engage with you if you will enable that, And I'd say we had about a 50-50 success rate with that, but it did improve once I kind of gave, kind of this preparatory speech of sorts.
Yeah.
And
in a sense, you gave them permission to feel scared.
Yeah, I guess.
And that this is an anxious time. And unfortunately, let me just say, our churches are feeling anxious right now. And our people coming in the doors have anxiety in their homes. And the last thing we need in our church is to have anxiety, but that's the best place for us to have it, because we have a God in Jesus Christ that'll give us grace and mercy and presence. But how many times we lose the capacity to be empathetic for the person next to us who is speaking a different tune than we play. And we feel anxious about that. And then we start to try to protect ourselves, etc. And we lose that capacity to just be with one another. This is not something, I talk about it as though I understand it and I can do it, but I fail at this miserably sometimes because of my own God-given capacity to feel scared. And so, I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, anybody else have a comment or a question they'd like to pose?
I have a question.
Yes.
How does upbringing play into this, our upbringing? And the reason, I'll just say this quickly, I feel, and I've had this talk with my husband, I feel sometimes when I get emotional, he will say to me, let's not get emotional. Let's not get emotional. And I've said to him, is there something in your background where you were not allowed to cry or be sad or whatever? How does the upbringing play into this?
Oh, it's very important. And in family systems, we really look at family of origin and multi-generations and what's the message in the family. But it's interesting, I'm a middle child, okay? And how middle children empathize differently than oldest children, and how oldest children empathize different than youngest children, how, what are the messages that each of us as children hear differently from what's going on in the system, and how children take on the anxiety of the parents in different ways, and we learn how to deal with this by not feeling, and please don't I don't want to hear it. I want to go out and play, okay? And so but family of origin is powerful, as well as family experiences. One pastor was talking about the death of her brother in an accident when she was 15 years old. He was 19 and he died in an accident because he had diabetes, and he went to sleep and was killed. And how the last thing she had done was slammed her locker door when he came up to ask her if she would take him to get his truck fixed. And she was angry at him, and she had felt responsible for his death all this time, and how that in itself kept her from feeling whenever there was a death. Okay, life experiences, all of us have them. And yes, that does play into it. And lots of times it is being able to, and if I can step into your stuff, Kathryn, it is being able to tell our story and being heard. Nothing more valuable than a child telling their story and being heard. And I confess, I wish I'd have been a grandparent first. I would have heard my child better, because I hear my grandkids, just their stories, while their parents are trying to figure out how to survive. Okay, so it is a multi-generational thing, and I think the calling of all grandparents is to hear the stories of our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. I think there are some people here who even have great-grandchildren. But does anybody ever feel anxious about the parenting of our children, of our grandchildren? And how do you balance that out of, well, I don't want to give them advice, because advice starts to feel like a critical parent. And what am I trying to do? I'm trying to take care of my scared child. See how that system plays out? I hope this is helpful for people.
Thank
Bill,
you, Bill.
Bill,
Yeah.
you said that in the triangle, there's a rescuer, a victim, and I didn't catch the third,
A persecutor.
persecutor.
Yeah. This happens very quickly. If I could take another minute, Kathryn.
Yeah.
It happened very quickly. For instance, when my son was little, Shirley and I were going to school full time, both of us, and so we would take turns, take him to bed. And this night he was playing with his Lego blocks, which is very serious for a little boy. And I was going to have to go in and say it's time to go to bed, which was not a thrilling experience. But I went in and I said, Chris, it's time to go to bed. So pick up your Lego blocks and go to bed. And of course, anybody want to guess what he said? No. And I said, no, it's really time to go to bed. Please pick up your block. No. So whenever adults begin to feel scared, we revert to 13, which is when we thought we were in control of our lives, but we blamed our parents. And so I said, Chris, it's time to get your blocks picked up. Now just pick up your blocks and get your butt in bed. Now, I was a persecutor, wasn't I? And he was the victim. Shirley was in the other room. The only other role is the rescuer. And so she said, Bill, couldn't you say that in a different way? How did that sound to me? A persecutor, right? And so I was the victim. So what did my son say? Mommy, stay out of it. We're doing fine. He became my rescuer, and my mom and Shirley became the victim. Okay, he was my rescuer, but in order to rescue, you move to the persecutor role. And that little movement, we lose our capacity for empathy. Okay, that's a whole nother chapter. So I gave you more. Thank you, Kathryn, for allowing
Thank you, Bill. And everybody, can we give Bill a big wave? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
And really appreciate it. And our next exercise actually is going to be about a story, telling your story. So thank you for that segue.
You're
I
welcome.
appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think he's set us on a good course here. You know, I encourage us to maybe spend more time in thinking, but being aware is really more of what it's about, and managing what we can to help us express our emotions in the most appropriate way. Maybe less critical, wild and scared, and more nurturing and free, more empathetic. I don't know. It's a tightrope at times, I think, as Bill was describing it, just in the way that the victim persecutor triangle goes. That's shifting in one single conversation. So we are in thorny content here in terms of really understanding and being aware of our own stuff in order to make us more empathetic, more nurturing. So to help us be better listeners in that regard, we're going to do a little 6-word faith story. And it was actually presented in the material that you were sent this week. And if you had time to review it, you may have already done your 6-word faith story. But in case you haven't, we're going to give you like 90 seconds or so to come up with it, because we are going to use that in our upcoming exercise to share some of them. These 6 words of faith will be what we use to practice our listening and our empathy skills in our breakout sessions. So here's a bit of history behind that. In 2014, the Reverend Just Cat started his hashtag on Twitter, my 6-word story of faith. And it kind of took off and people began to share that. And so here I show a few examples that the book and the study guide gave. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Held by love, I unlearned fear. I love Jesus, not his fans. Oh my God, I don't know. That one's kind of a favorite of mine. And then I just came up with mine. I guess I'm heavily steeped in the chorus right now. Action louder, God, faith, something bigger. So if you have your 6 words of faith, we're going to take time here, 90 seconds or so. We're going to run a little music and you can refine it and work with it. If you haven't done it yet, take a few moments to write down your own 6-word faith story. Mm-hmm. It can be definitive or complete, or it can be a first draft. It's open to change. You can do 2 or 3 of them, but you're going to need one for the exercise coming up. So just know that it's a work in progress. It always is, just like us. We're all works in progress, right? So the only rule is it can only be 6 words or less. Keep your faith story handy because you're going to use it. If you have one that's maybe a little too close, you can do a second one and maybe use that for the exercise and keep the one that's too close to yourself. But here we go. We're going to have that time for you to do that. So if you would start the music, we'll begin reviewing our 6-word faith stories.
Kathryn, if I could just
Yes.
say, I created mine in relation to my statements or my thing. And mine is God loves and hugs my scared child.
I think that was 7.
I know.
But thank you for sharing.
Yes.
It's great to model. So now you get the idea of it. So here we go. I get the distinct impression that you all did your homework very well. There are some great 6-word faith stories showing up in the chat. So if you don't have your chat turned on, I encourage you to do so, because there's some really good stuff being shared there. And it leads into our breakout session on attentive listening. What we're going to do is we're going to break into small groups and allow each person 1 to 2 minutes to kind of unpack their 6 words chosen. You know, this doesn't tell your whole life story. That's not what it's intended to do. It's to give a little snapshot of your faith journey in 6 words. And you can just take that 90 seconds or 2 minutes to just tell a little bit more about what you were communicating. So listeners should attempt to connect and empathize at the speaker and the significance of the words being shared. I encourage you to mute yourself when you're not speaking, to face your screen and watch the person who is speaking. Zoom makes it challenging sometimes to make that connection. So be aware of your facial expressions and your nonverbal, so that that person feels like they are the only person in the Zoom room speaking and that you're paying full attention. And sometimes I know when you get put on the spot, you freeze up, or you just feel ill at ease. Well, just relax. And to be honest, if you don't want to do it, just say pass. It's okay. So let's begin our small groups to unpack our 6 words of faith. That's great. I hope your conversations were as rich as the group that I was in. That was pretty awesome. So let's debrief a little bit on the 6-word faith stories. I'm going to, pose this question, and then I would like, 1 or 2 people to share an answer to the question, and the rest of you, if you just want to go ahead and put it in the chat, that would be great, so that we can capture it for everyone else. But so our first question is, in what ways could you incorporate attentive listening into your daily life? Would someone like to respond to that?
Well, I'd have to say, I think it makes for a better marriage if you try to listen, really listen to what's being said, not what you think you want to hear.
Someone wrote, eliminate distractions. That's if you're intently listening, you're not distracted.
Put the phone down.
Yeah.
I would like to mention that Stephen Ministry Training teaches us this. And so for the last 20 some years, if the phone rings and it's somebody who needs to express themselves, the first thing I always do is say, just a minute, I'm turning my TV off, or something like that. And that way they know that they have my full attention. And especially since I'm hard of hearing, I really have to turn the TV off, or at least turn the sound down. So it's been a good exercise for me that I've been able to use every day.
Anyone else?
People do tend to think about what they want to say while you're talking instead of listening to you. And so therefore they don't really hear what you have to say. And that's can be a bad habit of mine. I'll just have to admit it. So that hampers listening.
Gotcha. Someone else said,
My
stop
husband,
multitasking. That's a good one.
my husband is very hard of hearing, and he hears what he wants to hear sometimes. And that's very difficult for me. But he says, I've never known anybody who's got better ears than you do. Your ears are as good as a cat's ears.
Very good.
Didn't like it when I was a substitute because they could be talking and whispering in the back of the room. And I'd say, would you like to say that for the whole class?
Very attentive listening. We have a second question. So the second question is, what changes in your daily life might attentive listening bring about? If we were all great listeners like we are striving to be, what might happen in our lives? Well, Belinda, you kind of mentioned that your marriage, communication improves, more understanding, probably less anxiety, less misunderstanding. Anyone else?
I try to remember the old adage that God gave us one mouth and 2 ears that we might listen twice as much as we speak.
Very good. But how's that going to change your life?
By shutting up,
And what does shutting up achieve?
listening more and more attentively, paying attention to what other people are saying rather than somebody earlier mentioned thinking of the next thing I want to say.
Karen Bueno has a good one in the chat.
That causes us to have empathy, and then we can relate to their story, hopefully.
Karen shares, I might go a little slower. I tend to go on to the next thing on my agenda rather than take time for a conversation. We might be more considerate of others, fewer misunderstandings, deeper friendships. One result is less conflict and more cooperation. Anybody else want to share out loud?
Well, I might get in touch with some feelings that scare me if I'm really listening.
And then what?
There's a lot more conversation to follow.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's the emotional connection that becomes very, very valuable in that process.
And one other thing is that if we listen attentively, we might get to know more of the situation of the person, and it may cause us to make decisions differently than we have done if we didn't know the person or the situation.
Very good. There's really good ones in the chat too. People might come to you when they need someone to talk to. Result of listening might be some healing. There, just remind you too, we're going to copy all these chat comments and put them in the email that you get next week, so you have that to reflect on as well. Anyone else want to comment before we go to our break?
I'm thinking it's a lot easier to listen if you have a chance to talk one-on-one than if it's always a lot of people around, or more people that you would like to hear what's really happening, then you can make your way around. I would think like at church or something like that, that there isn't always time to talk individually with all of the people that you'd really like to have a chance to find out how they're really doing or what's really going on. It's mostly, so often it's just, hi, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, bye, and on to the next person. Life is quite complicated much of the time.
Yeah, it's kind of that, trying to make that decision whether you want to talk to 10 people for real shallow conversations or if you want to hit a couple with some deeper meaning.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's good. Well, this has been great. So take a little break, caffeine up if you need to, and we're going to have our little breathing exercises that takes us into our break, and we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes, which would be 8:34. Great. When I worked in the Great Plains Conference, the pastors had started in what he calls centers, and there are 3 of them that comprise kind of going through his thing. And you know, there'd be these pastoral conversations and yada 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 yada, family systems, blah blah blah, yada yada yada, family systems, blah, 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 you know. And I'm like, what's this family systems thing? And so I convinced my director of connectional ministries that I should go figure out what this family system things is so I could write about it, right? So I didn't go through all 3 centers, but I did go through one. And I can tell you the one center equipped me well to deal with my husband's period of caretaking and passing and all of that. And I just feel like I owe him a debt of gratitude for that alone. So the stuff is good, it's quality, and hopefully you got a couple takeaways. He was trying to put probably one whole session into about 20 minutes. So, but that anxiety, the scared part, all of that is really some of those things that keep us from being able to empathize. So we're going to do a breakout session next, and we're going to figure out how we might incorporate that intentional listening into our daily life, and also how that might change things for us. In our next breakout session, we're going to examine the barriers to that a little further, a little deeper. If we want to listen attentively, and we know it will change how we live, let's look closer at what gets in the way of that. And some of the things on the slide talks about what gets in the way of empathetic listening, what supports empathy. So in our breakout group, I'd like you to kind of split the time between what gets in the way and then what supports empathy. And you can just jot them down, however is handy. I would encourage you to have a recorder and that sort of thing so that we can do that. In Stephen's book, he highlights social principles actually, and talks about how the discipline states injustice is not equally distributed. And social principles also go on to say that we have a responsibility for the basic rights of all persons to equal access to housing, education, communication, employment, medical care, legal redress for grievances, and physical protection. And tonight's study talks about basic needs. You know, if there's no sustenance or you don't have any ability to thrive or live, access to those other things really becomes inconsequential. So it's only when we have our own needs met that we can move on to love our neighbor as ourselves. It's our prominent reflection really for the discussion. Empathy grows out of that affinity for other people. So let's use this breakout session to further explore the barriers to that empathy. We're going to use the time in the breakout room to discuss the 2 questions that I posed before, and I'll put them in the chat for you as well so that you'll have them. But what gets in the way of listening? What supports empathy? What gets in the way of empathetic listening? What supports empathy? And I am going to put them in the chat. And
I just did, so we have them in there now.
Way ahead of me as always. So let's have our time together.
You're muted, Kathryn.
Welcome back. Great discussion. I am going to open to the group again to discuss our question of what gets in the way of empathy. And then we can answer in the chat as well as
You're muted again.
Kathryn, I'm sorry. My mouse clicked on you instead.
I don't know where we left off, but we're going to discuss in a large group what gets in the way of empathy. I invite 1 or 2 people to share out loud, and the rest I wish you would maybe put some of the discussion that you had in your small group in the chat so that we can all see that as well. But what gets in the way of empathy? Anyone? Well, I can share a couple of the things that came up in my group, and one was that we get blinded by the situation. If there's something tragic happening, if there's something, uncomfortable to it, we start worrying about how we're going to react and what we're going to say and what we're going to do. And we forget to just look at what's happening and empathize with the situation. It becomes more about us than it does the situation. Anyone else want to share?
I was going to say our own emotions and attitudes towards situations that we haven't really dealt with. And so because of that, we are not ready to be empathetic towards others.
That's good. There's a good one in the chat. Hearing problems. I mean, this is an interesting twist on the answer to the question, because there's sometimes physical impediments to communicating. And so we need to be aware of that. Being judgmental is another one that came up. What gets in the way of empathy? Selfishness, mind elsewhere, busy, you need to set aside time, interruptions.
And that time can really be a huge problem. I mean, if you know of a bunch of situations and you really would like to be able to go into detail with several different people, and you just can't do the time. You just can't find it. It doesn't work out. Yeah.
So you kind of have to make a decision.
Yeah.
There's one in the chat, in the way of empathy. Put your schedule aside, and you want to give advice rather than listen. Your mind goes elsewhere. You get busy with your own answer, share your experience, but don't, let them talk. Your own to-do list interferes. Anyone else want to share out loud?
Knowing what to say, what to ask.
Yeah, sometimes I was telling a story earlier when my husband was ill. I had a friend come and stay towards the end. We called her my wing woman. And the wing woman was just simply to be here. And she was here after a few days. She's like, I'm not doing anything. I don't know what to do. I'm not helping you. And, she would do little things around the house, but she was feeling like she wasn't contributing. And I said, you don't understand. Your ministry is one of presence. I mean, you're just being there, available, and to listen and to do that is a huge thing. And, I think we always feel like we need to be doing something, I get that.
Well, we said in our group that, what you said about what your husband needed, that would give somebody the permission to ask questions that they might not otherwise be comfortable asking, that you don't know which questions are appropriate for a particular person in some situations, what is okay to ask. So it's good to know.
It's kind of that scared thing kicking in, isn't it?
Yeah. You don't want to make it worse for them. You don't want to make it harder. You're trying to make it so they can share what they want to share.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So great stuff in the chat about what gets in the way of empathy. Great comments. We're going to move on to the next question related to that. The second part of what we discussed, which is, what supports empathy. One of them I thought of was patience. If you're not a patient person, you won't give the time to be a good listener and to be empathetic.
We also said that the situation, our situation supports empathy, and certainly our history. I know when I went through my divorce, I didn't realize how that would affect my ministry in terms of people finding out about that and then coming and talking to me and realizing that I could be empathetic because I had been through it.
That's good. And there's eye contact. I think that's a great one. You know, people will feel like you're more engaged if you're looking right in them, engaging with them. Support groups. What supports empathy? Number 10 says plan a time to call them on the phone so there is enough time. Be non-judgmental, excuse me, and non-defensive. Get into their stories, lay your own thoughts aside, and just be there. Again, we're not going to lose any of this because we're going to copy all of this from the chat and put it into your email next week so you can see many more of these great chat responses. Accept that everyone is a child of God. If you accept that, your propensity for empathy is going to be much greater. We've covered a lot of ground so far. Our final segment on empathy across borders is going to really get us into bearing witness in a way that moves us from one moment to the next. If you remember the perspectival moments, it's what Stevens calls it. Bearing witness is a progression. After claiming our self-worth and that of others, we move to being present in the moment. The second moment of bearing witness is where we move to the third movement, where a desire for historical clarity, which will help us put our, bearing witness into a context, both past and future. And our fourth moment is advocacy. Our presence leads to awareness, which leads to advocacy. The book used Doctors Without Borders as an example of a non-United Methodist nonprofit bearing witness in the kingdom. The empathy chart exercise is one we will do together, but the story of Doctors Without Borders is unique in that Doctors Without Borders doesn't preclude advocacy or being outspoken. The book addresses diakonia, where there is actually a DIAKONIA World Federation, and it's defined as Christian service to which all the baptized are called and in which part of the mission of Christ Church in the world. It's not simply service, but refers to the role of a messenger, spokesperson, representative, or attendant, the agency of a superior, given all the authority required for the task. That's really what diakonia is. And really, we serve as God's ambassadors to others. And so in this exercise we're going to do together, we're going to contrast these different nonprofits that are, or the events and the things that are going on there in a way that we see on this chart. So the event or the group is on the left side, and they're all numbered on the left side as well. And there is actions at the top. So for example, if we would pick number 4, the Red Cross, the activity would be what? Go into a fire, feeding the hungry. What are the actions that Red Cross does?
Respond to disasters.
Response to disasters.
And wars.
And wars. But what do they do?
They deliver food.
Food.
For us, or they provide medical
aid. Yep.
I just saw a movie about the rescue of the people on the airline that went down, and I didn't realize they had blankets that they gave people for comfort. Those people getting out of the water were very wet and cold, and they gave them blankets, and I thought, what a good idea,
Yeah. So they're full of great actions. So what's the witness part of that? And The way I'm kind of looking at this, because I think it's a little cumbersome the way that Stevens presents it. Actions is kind of, like we said, it's the blankets, it's the food, it's the medical, but the witness is really kind of the ethical code that motivates us into that action. So in their first example, the exodus of the Hebrew people from Egypt, there were plagues, they escaped, the water parted, all of those things. But the core, the ethical thing was God bears witness to the suffering. Let my people go. You refer to Miriam's song. Well, if we look at the Red Cross, what's the witness part of that? What's the ethical code?
Well, the biblical the biblical code would be when we feed the hungry, we are feeding Jesus. When we take care of people, we are loving Christ.
Very good. Let's pick another one. Civil rights struggles, number 5. But I'm going to change the columns a little bit. I prefer to kind of switch it around. I'd rather look at, let's talk about what the bearing witness would be. What is the moral code? What's the ethical code that would motivate action as it comes to the civil rights movement?
Equality.
Sense of justice.
Equality. Did we say
Equality,
that?
justice, those are good.
All people are valuable. Yeah, we are all God's children.
Love your neighbor as yourself comes up again, doesn't it?
Mm.
So what's the actions? Civil rights struggles of 2020. What comes to mind? Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, but I think it's going backwards.
Marches.
Yeah, I was thinking marches.
Changing laws.
If they're trying to affect the political structure.
Voter rights.
Voting rights. Voting rights.
Yeah.
More equitable lines drawn for congressional and other political districts.
That's more of, I would say, the struggle.
Or solutions, perhaps, yeah.
So some of the actions might be some of the civil and lawsuits and court battles that have gone on to bring about awareness to some of the inequities in the justice system. I think that's a tough one. I mean, if you look back to the 60s, you can say it was the marches, it was the speeches, it was, taking action. Go ahead.
Get the vote out.
Get out the vote. Exactly.
Well, I think the civil rights issues of the 60s are really not too much different than they are right now. I mean, it also took action on behalf of getting leaders to agree to some of the things that we believe of as being just and fair and right to provide equality and equity and justice for all people, not just a few.
So number 11 is blank. Does somebody want to pick a story or an event or a nonprofit and share what they think the ethical or the moral code is and what actions they've taken that reflect that moral code? If you name the group you want to look at, we can all contribute to the other two categories.
Ignoring climate change.
Okay, climate change. What is the moral code?
Love your mother.
Well, taking care of God's creation.
Yes.
But it's taking care of people because it's affecting all kinds of people too.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the intrinsic worth of everyone. And if you do believe in that, then you would take care of everything as well. Oversimplistic, but. So what are some of the actions? I mean, we just covered a lot of that in our last Mission U study, so.
Just sharing the knowledge about what's happening.
Yeah, sharing knowledge, sharing actions that can be taken and shared, sharing even on the advocacy and the political side, writing your legislators. I mean, all those things are actions that are being taken, and they're really motivated out of that creation care.
Get an electric car, get solar on your roof.
Yeah.
Saving water, turning your air conditioner up.
Taking your church to net zero.
Yeah. Well, let's go back up the list. The Me Too movement of the 2010s. What are some of the actions?
Speaking up when you're assaulted.
You know, really
telling your story publicly.
People stepping up and telling their stories and being listened to, and a lot of attention probably be given to the fact that these stories weren't listened to.
Being encouraging to people who have spoken up, because sometimes they bear a lot of feedback from people that are not very nice in how they tell them on their websites, different things. So to give support.
They have to kind of get over their own personal shame.
Holding the perpetrators responsible, as they did with Giuliani. Not Giuliani, Cuomo, Governor Cuomo.
Actually seeing litigation happen. The media really played a lot of a part in breaking stories that were related to that when people didn't have a voice, they came in and provided that voice for them. So let's go back to the witness. What's the bearing witness piece? What's the moral code? Love thy neighbor as yourself.
Oh, that's good.
It's just valuing each person, not based on gender or anything else, just valuing each one.
The dignity and worth of everyone.
Respecting women.
Respecting women, that's good. Equity. So you get the idea of kind of how this works, in that we see how empathy even works in our political structure, in our nonprofit structure, in our organizational structures. And if we can be empathetic and become engaged, then it can help us lead to greater action, greater engagement. And as we get into next week's, when we talk about a little bit more of the historical context of some of this, we'll see more about, what's holding us back. Jim, did you have a question? I saw you. To bear witness is to say no to the suffering of our neighbor, and to bear witness is to speak out on behalf of our neighbor for their full ability to flourish. So, as we think about Doctors Without Borders, empathy motivates them to both act and to bear witness. And that whole story is kind of on page 46 of the book. And while some nonprofits, I've worked for some nonprofits where you could not be actively engaged in politics. So as we continue on into the more action-oriented aspects of the study, well, you'll probably want to consider the groups and organizations that you engage with that might be doing good, but are you able to kind of do that whole package of being a person of agency for that cause? Can you take action? Can you actually effectively make change in the systems or the particular situation you might find yourself advocating for? So to kind of recap our session so far, attentive presence has been what we've been discussing all evening, and its relationship to empathy. And without love, we can't do any of it. We can't separate the love of God and the love of neighbor. We love the Lord, love your neighbor. The two laws are interconnected, and Jesus makes it clear that there's no way to love God without also loving those who are created in God's image. Going back to the self-worth, our prevenient grace, our existence. Attentive presence through empathy is a means of discerning God's will that leads us to awareness and advocacy. As the corporate body of Christ, our individual practice of empathy informs the witness of the church, the body of the church. And I have some questions up on the screen. These are just a few. In your book, there are several box sections, prayerful activities, and other questions for consideration. In our time together here, we're able to lift out certain segments of the content of the book, but there's so much additional content in the book to be examined and thought about. So, as I said, these are just 3 questions that I lifted out from just tonight's work. There are a lot of great questions in the book, and also the prayerful activities that I think will enrich the study as we move through it. And now, as we work towards our closing time, I would like to invite Char Elliott again to once again lead us in a closing prayer.
Knowing God, you sent Jesus to walk this earth as a human being. You know our suffering, our feelings, our experiences. Thank you for the incarnation, the ultimate form of empathy. Expand our ability to empathize with our human siblings and grant us understanding and grace when we have conflict. Amen.
This is mission study.
Someone have a comment, or do we need to mute someone? Thank you. As I said last week, I'm going to use this slide probably every session just to remind us. Do not be fooled into thinking that you bring God to a neighbor bereft of the holy. You do not bear Christ as if God's love were a commodity that only Christians have the privilege of meting out to the less fortunate. Next week, Wednesday, July 27th, 7 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, we'll be back. We're going to focus on historical clarity. We're going to explore our relationship to historical sin. We're going to look at current issues of systemic injustice, and we're going to identify where we can hope in the midst of all that despair. I am still so privileged to work with you all on this study, and know that there is so much to be shared and so little time to share it. And in that vein, I just also want to remind you that there is a giving opportunity that we can make to United Women of Faith and to the conference mission team. You can donate at the conference website. Actually, it's the UMW website, www.mountainskyumw.org. Don't worry about taking all this down. I'm going to put it in the email next week as well. But you can also donate by check, and do make the check out to United Methodist Women. There's still some paperwork that needs to be done to make that transition to United Women of Faith. So checks should be made payable to United Methodist Women, and send those to Robin Ball, the conference UMW treasurer, at P.O. Box 4960 at Pagosa Springs, Colorado, 81157. And again, we will share that in the email. And then the next screen just shows you what it looks like online. You simply, once you get to the website, you'll put your money amount in there where that $20 is. It's just, you type that in there, and then there's just a series of prompts that you will follow. And it's pretty easy, actually. I've actually used it myself, and you can do it either way. And we would love to have your contributions to promote all the things that United Women of Faith and the conference mission team collaborate to do. And Karen,
And you know, Kathryn, this is Karen Bueno speaking, and I'm supposed to be off of mute.
You are.
Yeah, okay, good. I didn't have to pay for any food for either of these two sessions. I just went to my own refrigerator and coffee machine, and I didn't have to travel anywhere except just from the living room to my computer. And I didn't even have to pay a registration. Well, I did buy the book, but otherwise, you know, this didn't cost me anything. I didn't even have to buy a new outfit because you'd all be looking at me in my clothing. So that's going to inspire me that my donation might be really big, because this not only supports United Women of Faith and all of their projects, but also the whole church, because the total donation will be split in half with the Mountain Sky Conference, which is supporting all of our missionaries of the church. And so I'd encourage you to think seriously about giving your donation at this time.
Thanks, Karen. I know that a lot of us would like to still be together to do these studies, but our participation numbers indicate that this has been really beneficial to a lot of people to be able to take part when maybe costs would have prohibited them from doing it otherwise, or even the space and time to travel somewhere to do it. And so the planning team is working on some ways that we can incorporate some more person-to-person type of activity and experience along with this. And a couple of those ideas are to take your Zoom screen into your local church or someone's home and watch it as a group. And then you kind of got a ready-made group there that you can also, once the session is over or you meet another time, you can unpack more of the content together and have more of the camaraderie and the fellowship that we often enjoy as part of Mission U. That's just one thought. Another thought was to, next time there's an annual conference, maybe preceding it, we might consider having some kind of hybrid session of in-person and a small study that would allow people to get together and share some fellowship time as well. So we are thinking about that because we know that's an important part of what United Women of Faith and the people that participate in Mission U value. And so we're aware of it. And if you have ideas, please send me an email. We're all ears about how we can do that and do it in a way that would bless most of the body. So go figure, where it's 9:19, we're like ahead of time. That never happens. And so I am so thrilled with the discussion tonight. I think it was very rich. And so we will conclude our night together with a song called Waymaker. And she sings to our looking to God to make our way. God bless you and keep you until we meet next week. And good night. Our work for tonight is complete. Thank you. God bless.
You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. Hey, Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Touching every heart, I worship you. I worship you. You are here, healing every heart. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, turning lives around. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, mending every heart. I worship you. I worship you. Hey, we make a miracle walker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. That is who you are. Hey, we make a miracle walker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You wipe away all tears. You mend the broken heart. You're the answer to it all. Jesus, you wipe away all tears. You mend the broken heart. You're the answer to it all, to it all. Jesus, yeah. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You are here, touching every life. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, meeting every need. I worship you. I worship you. Oh
Shande Amazeke Ane.